The morning of October 15th, 2003, began like any other at Millbrook Elementary School in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The autumn leaves painted the small town in shades of amber and rust, and the crisp air carried the familiar scent of burning firewood from nearby chimneys. Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old third-grade teacher, had been part of this community for 8 years, long enough to know every child's favorite color, every parent's coffee order at the local diner, and every crack in the sidewalk leading to the red brick schoolhouse. Sarah was the kind of teacher children remembered decades later. She had a way of making multiplication tables feel like secret codes and turning reading time into grand adventures. Her classroom, Room 12, was a sanctuary of learning where hand-drawn posters covered every wall, and student artwork hung proudly from clotheslines stretched corner to corner. The chalkboard at the front of the room bore traces of countless lessons, erased and rewritten in Sarah's neat, careful handwriting. That Tuesday morning, Sarah arrived at school at 7:15 a.m., as she had every day for the past 8 years. Margaret Torres, the school secretary, remembered seeing her walk through the main entrance, her canvas bag slung over one shoulder, a thermos of coffee in her hand. Sarah wore her favorite burgundy cardigan, the one her mother had knitted for her birthday, and her dark hair was pulled back in the simple bun she always favored during the school week. "Good morning, Maggie," Sarah had said, using the nickname she'd given the secretary years ago. Her voice carried its usual warmth, though Margaret would later recall something different in her eyes that morning, a distant quality, as if Sarah was looking at something the rest of them couldn't see. The first bell rang at 8 a.m. sharp, and 23 third-graders filed into Room 12, their voices a familiar chorus of excitement and sleepy morning chatter. Sarah greeted each child by name, as she always did, asking Tommy about his loose tooth, reminding Emma to hang up her jacket, and helping little Marcus tie his shoes. The day unfolded with its typical rhythm: morning announcements, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the gentle transition into the day's first lesson. Sarah had planned a unit on local history that week. She wanted her students to understand their place in the world, to see themselves as part of a larger story that stretched back generations. On the chalkboard, she had written in her distinctive script, "Cedar Falls, Our Town's Story." Below it, she had drawn a simple timeline marking the founding of the town in 1851, the arrival of the railroad in 1873, and the establishment of their very own Millbrook Elementary in 1954. The children were captivated. 8-year-old Jessica Patterson raised her hand and asked if their school was older than her grandmother. Sarah smiled and explained that yes, the school had been educating children for nearly 50 years. She talked about all the students who had sat in these very desks, who had learned to read at these tables, who had grown up to become doctors and teachers and farmers and dreamers. "Someday," Sarah told them, "you'll be part of this town's history too. You'll have your own stories to tell. If this story moved you, you might want to subscribe. We tell stories like this every day, stories about ordinary people whose lives hold extraordinary mysteries." Lunch came and went without incident. Sarah sat with her colleagues in the faculty lounge, picking at her usual turkey sandwich and listening to the gentle complaints about parent conferences and budget cuts. She seemed quieter than usual. Her friend and fellow teacher Lisa Chen would later recall. When Lisa asked if everything was okay, Sarah had simply smiled and said, "Just thinking about time, how it moves, how it changes everything." The afternoon brought art class, where Sarah helped her students create family trees, encouraging them to ask their parents and grandparents about their ancestors. She moved between the desks with her characteristic patience, offering guidance and praise in equal measure. Her hands, always expressive when she taught, gestured as she explained how families grow and change, like the very trees they were drawing. At 3:15 p.m. the final bell rang. Sarah stood by the classroom door, as she did every day, saying goodbye to each child. "See you tomorrow," she told them, her voice carrying the same warmth it had held that morning. She watched as they gathered their backpacks and lunchboxes, as they lined up for the buses, as they scattered into the bright October afternoon. But Sarah Mitchell would never see them tomorrow. The custodian, Bill Henley, remembered seeing her at her desk around 4 p.m., grading papers under the fluorescent lights. Her burgundy cardigan was draped over the back of her chair, and she had removed her shoes. a habit she'd developed during her years of teaching. Bill had waved through the window, and Sarah had looked up and smiled. That same genuine smile she gave everyone, students and colleagues alike. At 6 p.m., Sarah's Toyota Camry was found running in the school parking lot, the driver's door open, her purse still on the passenger seat. Her keys dangled from the ignition, and her coffee thermos sat half empty in the cup holder. The car's headlights cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating the empty space where Sarah should have been. The search began immediately. Cedar Falls was the kind of community where neighbors became family, where a missing person was everyone's concern. Volunteers combed through the nearby woods, calling Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse. Police officers questioned every person who had seen her that day, retracing her steps with the desperate precision of people who couldn't accept that someone could simply vanish. Sarah's apartment on Maple Street stood undisturbed. Her bed was made, her dishes were clean, and her lesson plans for the rest of the week sat neatly arranged on her kitchen table. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that she had planned to leave. Her suitcases remained in the closet, her clothes hung in perfect order, and her goldfish Galileo swam in lazy circles in his bowl by the window. The investigation stretched on for weeks, then months. Detectives from the state police joined the local officers, bringing with them the kind of resources that Cedar Falls had never needed before. They analyzed fingerprints, interviewed potential witnesses, and followed leads that led nowhere. Sarah's photograph appeared on missing person posters throughout Iowa and beyond, her kind eyes looking out from grocery store bulletin boards and gas station windows. The hardest part was the questions that had no answers. Why would Sarah leave her car running? Where would she go without her purse, her keys, her carefully planned lessons? The people of Cedar Falls wrestled with these mysteries, turning them over in their minds like stones worn smooth by constant handling. Sarah's students were the most affected. These 23 children who had looked forward to tomorrow's continuation of their town's story found themselves part of a different kind of history, one marked by absence and unanswered questions. The school brought in counselors, and room 12 remained empty for weeks, its chalkboard still bearing the timeline Sarah had drawn on that last day. As autumn turned to winter, the search efforts gradually diminished. The volunteers returned to their normal lives. The police redirected their resources to other cases, and the missing person posters began to fade and curl at the edges. Sarah Mitchell had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a mystery that the town of Cedar Falls would carry like a scar. But in room 12, something waited. Behind the timeline and the drawings, beneath layers of chalk dust and erased lessons, a message remained, patient and silent, holding its secrets until the right moment would come to reveal them. The chalkboard remembered everything. 3 years had passed since Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, and Cedar Falls had learned to live with the weight of unanswered questions. The town had found its rhythm again, though it was different now, more cautious, more aware of how quickly the familiar could become strange. Children who had been in 2nd grade when Sarah vanished were now in middle school, and the newest students at Millbrook Elementary knew her only as a story their older siblings whispered about. Room 12 had eventually been reopened, though it took nearly a year to find a teacher willing to work there. The school district had offered the position to several candidates, but something about the space seemed to unsettle people. Perhaps it was the way the afternoon light fell across the empty desks, or the subtle creaks the old building made when the wind picked up. More likely, it was the knowledge that Sarah Mitchell had simply walked out of this room one October evening and never returned. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez had finally accepted the position in the fall of 2004. She was a veteran educator from Des Moines, recently widowed and looking for a fresh start in a smaller community. Eleanor was practical and unsentimental, qualities that served her well in a classroom that others found haunting. She had the walls repainted a cheerful yellow, replaced the bulletin boards, and brought in new plants to brighten the space. The only thing she kept unchanged was the chalkboard, a massive slate that had served generations of teachers and students. Eleanor's approach to teaching was methodical and thorough. She didn't encourage the kind of creative chaos that had characterized Sarah's classroom, preferring structured lessons and clear expectations. Her students adapted, as children always do, though some of the older ones occasionally mentioned how different things had been before. Eleanor would nod politely and redirect their attention to the day's lesson, maintaining the professional distance that had served her well throughout her career. The first 2 years in room 12 passed without incident. Eleanor established her routines, built relationships with her colleagues, and gradually became part of the Millbrook Elementary community. She was competent and caring, if not particularly inspiring. The parents appreciated her consistency, the administration valued her experience, and the students learned to respect her quiet authority. But Eleanor noticed things that others missed. She had a keen eye for detail, developed over decades of managing classrooms and observing children. She noticed how some students would glance toward the back corner of the room, where Sarah's desk had once stood. She noticed how the chalk seemed to wear down more quickly than it should, leaving residue that was difficult to clean. Most of all, she noticed the chalkboard itself. It was an old-fashioned slate, the kind that had been standard in schools for decades before whiteboards became popular. The surface was scarred with countless erasures, bearing the ghostly imprints of lessons taught and forgotten. Eleanor had grown accustomed to its quirks, the way certain areas held chalk better than others, the spots where the slate had been worn smooth by years of use. In the spring of 2006, Eleanor began to notice something strange. No matter how thoroughly she cleaned the chalkboard at the end of each day, faint marks would appear by morning. At first she attributed it to the building's age, perhaps moisture in the air, or the way the chalk dust settled overnight. But the marks seemed deliberate, forming patterns that suggested intention rather than accident. Eleanor was not a superstitious woman. She had taught in enough schools to know that old buildings had their own personalities, their own ways of settling and breathing. But these marks troubled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. They appeared in the same general area each time, roughly in the center of the board, and they seemed to form letters, faint, incomplete, but unmistakably purposeful. She began to document what she saw, sketching the marks in a small notebook she kept locked in her desk drawer. The patterns varied from day to day, but they consistently appeared in the same location. Sometimes they looked like fragments of words, other times like random scratches. Eleanor found herself arriving at school earlier each morning, eager to see what new marks had appeared overnight. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance had officially concluded in 2005, though it remained an open case. The police had exhausted their leads, the FBI had returned to their other priorities, and the town had gradually accepted that they might never know what happened to their beloved teacher. Sarah's apartment had been cleaned out, her belongings distributed among family members, and her car had been returned to the insurance company. But Eleanor knew that some mysteries refused to stay buried. She had lived long enough to understand that the past has a way of asserting itself, of demanding attention when we least expect it. The marks on the chalkboard felt like a manifestation of that truth, a reminder that some stories are never really finished. One morning in early May, Eleanor arrived at school to find the marks more pronounced than ever before. They formed a clear shape now, unmistakably letters, H-E-L-P. The word stretched across the center of the board in Sarah's familiar handwriting, as if she had written it herself just moments before Eleanor arrived. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her coffee growing cold in her hands, staring at the impossible message. She had cleaned the board thoroughly the night before, as she always did. The custodian, Bill Henley, the same man who had found Sarah's abandoned car, had locked the building and set the alarm. No one else had access to the room overnight. Yet there it was, a cry for help written in chalk on a board that should have been clean. Eleanor's rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps moisture had caused old chalk residue to become visible. Perhaps someone was playing an elaborate prank. Perhaps the stress of working in Sarah's former classroom had finally gotten to her, causing her to see things that weren't there. But in her heart, Eleanor knew she was looking at something that defied rational explanation. The handwriting was too precise, too familiar. She had seen Sarah's lesson plans in the school's archives, had studied the neat script that had once filled this very chalkboard with lessons about local history and mathematical equations. Eleanor stood there for a long time, watching the sunlight move across the message, wondering what she should do. She thought about calling the police, but what would she tell them? That a missing teacher had left a message on a chalkboard 3 years after her disappearance? They would think she was losing her mind. Instead, she made a decision that would change everything. She carefully copied the message into her notebook, photographed it with her digital camera, and then slowly erased it. As she wiped away the last traces of chalk, she whispered, "I hear you, Sarah. I hear you." The marks appeared again the next morning and the morning after that. Each time Eleanor documented them before erasing them, building a record of what seemed to be communications from beyond. The messages grew more complex, more urgent. Words became sentences, sentences became pleas. Eleanor knew she was the only one who could see them clearly, the only one who understood their significance. She had become the keeper of Sarah's secret, the guardian of a mystery that the town of Cedar Falls thought had been buried with the case files. But Eleanor also knew that secrets have a way of demanding to be told, and that some messages are too important to keep hidden forever. The chalkboard was speaking, and someone needed to listen. By the summer of 2007, Eleanor Vasquez had filled 3 notebooks with her careful documentation of the chalkboard messages. What had started as isolated words had evolved into complex communications, appearing with increasing frequency and urgency. Eleanor had become an expert at reading the faint chalk markings, interpreting their meaning like an archaeologist deciphering ancient texts. The messages followed a pattern. They appeared overnight, always in the same location on the board, always in Sarah's distinctive handwriting. They began with simple words: help, remember, find, but gradually became more elaborate. Eleanor recorded each one meticulously, photographing the markings before erasing them, maintaining the secret that had become her burden and her obsession. The most recent message had shaken Eleanor to her core. It appeared on a Thursday morning in late June, when the school was empty except for the summer maintenance crew. Eleanor had taken to visiting the classroom during the break, ostensibly to prepare for the coming year, but really to check on the messages that had become her connection to Sarah Mitchell. The message was longer than any before. "The truth is in the foundation. Look beneath where I taught them about home." Eleanor stared at the words, her heart racing. This was different from the previous messages, more specific, more directive. Sarah wasn't just crying for help anymore. She was providing guidance, offering a clue to her own mystery. But what did it mean? What foundation? What was beneath the place where she had taught about home? Eleanor's mind raced back to her knowledge of Sarah's teaching methods. She had read through years of lesson plans, had spoken with colleagues who remembered Sarah's classroom techniques. Sarah had been known for her hands-on approach to learning, her ability to make abstract concepts tangible for her young students. When she taught about families and communities, she often used the school itself as an example, talking about how Millbrook Elementary was like a home for learning. "Look beneath where I taught them about home." The words echoed in Eleanor's mind as she walked slowly around the empty classroom. Where had Sarah taught about home? At the chalkboard, certainly, but also at the reading corner, at the student desks, throughout the entire room. But if there was a foundation to be searched, it would have to be something more specific, more literal. Eleanor knelt beside the chalkboard, running her hands along the floor where Sarah would have stood during her lessons. The wooden floorboards were old but solid, showing the wear patterns of decades of teachers pacing back and forth. She pressed against each board, listening for any sound that might indicate a loose plank or hidden space. Nothing. She examined the walls around the chalkboard, looking for any irregularities or signs of disturbance. The paint was newer, applied when Eleanor had requested the room be refreshed, but beneath it she could see the outline of old nail holes and patches where bulletin boards had once hung. Still nothing that resembled a foundation or hiding place. Eleanor stepped back, frustrated. She was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs, but the messages had been too consistent, too specific to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate with her, and she was missing the meaning. She returned to the chalkboard, studying the message one more time before it would need to be erased. "The truth is in the foundation. Look beneath where I taught them about home." The words seemed to pulse with urgency, as if time was running out for their discovery. It was then that Eleanor remembered something Margaret Torres had mentioned years ago during one of their conversations about Sarah's teaching methods. Sarah had created a time capsule project with her students in the spring of 2003, just months before her disappearance. The children had written letters to their future selves, and Sarah had promised to bury the capsule somewhere special on the school grounds. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Could that be the foundation Sarah was referring to? Not the foundation of the building itself, but the foundation of memory, of preserved moments from her final semester of teaching. Margaret Torres was watering her garden when Eleanor knocked on her door that afternoon. The former school secretary was now in her 70s, enjoying retirement in a small house just blocks from Millbrook Elementary. Her memory was sharp, and she welcomed Eleanor's visit with the warmth of someone who had devoted her life to the school community. "Oh yes," Margaret said, settling into her porch swing with a glass of iced tea. "I remember that time capsule project. Sarah was so excited about it. She said it would help the children understand that they were part of something bigger than themselves, that their words and thoughts mattered." Eleanor leaned forward, trying to contain her excitement. "Do you remember where they buried it?" Margaret's eyes grew distant as she searched her memory. "It was somewhere on the school grounds, I'm sure of that. Sarah wanted it to be a place that was meaningful to the children, somewhere they could visit and remember. She talked about it being the heart of their school home, I think were her words. The heart of their school home." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Sarah had always referred to the school as a second home for her students, a place where they could feel safe and valued. If she had chosen to bury their time capsule at the heart of that home, where would it be? "Margaret," Eleanor said carefully, "did Sarah ever mention the specific location? Any landmarks or particular spots?" Margaret closed her eyes, concentrating. "There was something about the old oak tree. You know, the big one behind the playground. Sarah used to take the children there for outdoor lessons sometimes. She said it was like the grandfather of the school, watching over all the students who had played beneath its branches." Eleanor's heart raced. The oak tree was ancient, its massive trunk and sprawling branches creating a natural gathering place behind the school. It would have been the perfect spot for a time capsule, symbolic and accessible to the children who had contributed to it. "Did they have a ceremony?" Eleanor asked. "When they buried it?" "Oh yes," Margaret smiled at the memory. "It was a beautiful day in May. Sarah had the children dress up as if they were attending something important. They each read a portion of their letter aloud, and then they buried the capsule together. Sarah said it was like planting seeds of their memories, that someday they would grow into something beautiful." Eleanor thanked Margaret and drove back to the school, her mind racing with possibilities. If Sarah had hidden something at the oak tree, if there was truth to be found in that foundation of childhood memories, then perhaps the chalkboard messages were guiding her toward something important. The oak tree stood magnificent in the late afternoon light, its branches casting long shadows across the empty playground. Eleanor approached it slowly, studying the ground around its base. The grass was thick and well-maintained, showing no obvious signs of disturbance. But time capsules were meant to be hidden, to remain undisturbed until their intended opening. Eleanor knelt at the base of the tree, running her hands over the ground. The earth was soft here, protected by the canopy of leaves above. She found herself thinking about Sarah's students, imagining them gathered in this very spot 4 years ago, believing they were creating something that would last forever. As the sun began to set, Eleanor noticed something that made her breath catch. There, carved into the bark of the oak tree at child height, were initials and dates, not random graffiti, but carefully etched markers. SM 2003 stood out among them, along with what appeared to be a small arrow pointing toward the base of the tree. Eleanor followed the arrow's direction, pressing her hands against the earth. About 2 feet from the trunk, her fingers encountered something unexpected, a slight depression in the ground, as if the earth had settled over something buried beneath. She had found it. The foundation Sarah had written about, the place where truth waited to be discovered. Eleanor looked around the empty schoolyard, ensuring she was alone. Then she began to dig, her hands working frantically in the soft earth, following the guidance of a message that had appeared on a chalkboard in an empty classroom, written by a teacher who had vanished 4 years ago. What she would find beneath the oak tree would change everything. Eleanor's hands trembled as she brushed away the last of the dirt from the metal container buried beneath the oak tree. The time capsule was smaller than she had expected, roughly the size of a shoebox, made of stainless steel and sealed with a rubber gasket. Despite 4 years in the ground, it appeared to be in perfect condition, protected by Sarah's careful preparation. The summer evening was quiet except for the distant hum of air conditioners and the occasional car passing on Cedar Street. Eleanor knelt beside the oak tree, the time capsule cradled in her lap, knowing that whatever was inside would either confirm her growing suspicions or reveal her to be a woman driven to madness by isolation and grief. The container opened with a soft click, revealing its contents wrapped in plastic bags, protection against moisture and time. Eleanor's hands shook as she lifted out the first item, a folder containing 23 letters written in the careful handwriting of third graders. Each letter was addressed to the student's future self, filled with hopes and dreams and questions about what life would be like in 10 years. But beneath the children's letters, Eleanor found something that made her blood run cold. It was Sarah's own contribution to the time capsule, a sealed envelope marked for the future in her distinctive script. Inside, Eleanor discovered a letter that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. The letter was dated May 15, 2003, 5 months before Sarah vanished. It was written in Sarah's careful handwriting, but the words revealed a side of her that no one in Cedar Falls had ever suspected. If you are reading this, then something has happened to me. I hope I'm wrong, but I have reasons to believe that I may be in danger. I cannot go to the police because I have no proof, only suspicions and a growing fear that has consumed my thoughts for weeks. I discovered something I wasn't supposed to see. On April 23rd, I stayed late to finish grading papers. Around 7:30 p.m. I saw lights in the basement of the school. Strange, because the building should have been empty, except for Bill Henley, and he always works on the first floor. I went to investigate, thinking perhaps there was a maintenance issue that needed attention. What I found in the basement storage room will haunt me forever. There were boxes of school supplies that had been reported as stolen or missing over the past 2 years. Art supplies, textbooks, computer equipment, all items that the school board had claimed were lost to theft or damage. But they weren't lost. They were being systematically removed and stored, ready for transport. I hid and watched as Bill Henley and 2 men I didn't recognize loaded the boxes into a truck. They spoke in hushed tones about the next shipment and keeping the inventory low enough to avoid suspicion. I realized I was witnessing a theft operation that had been going on for years, stealing from the very children these supplies were meant to serve. I should have confronted them immediately, but I was terrified. These men seemed comfortable with their criminal activity, and I was alone in the building with them. I slipped back to my classroom and waited until they left. Then I gathered as much evidence as I could, serial numbers, photographs, documentation of the missing supplies. I've been trying to decide what to do with this information. Bill Henley has been at this school for 15 years. He has keys to everything, access to all areas, and the trust of the entire community. If I accuse him without overwhelming proof, who would believe me? And if he realizes I know about his operation, what might he do to protect himself? I'm frightened. Bill has been watching me more closely lately, asking questions about my schedule, my routines. Yesterday, he commented on how I stay late to grade papers, how I often work alone in the building. There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. I've hidden copies of my evidence in several places around the school. If something happens to me, if I disappear or if I'm found hurt, please know that it wasn't random. Look for the documentation I've hidden. Check the basement storage room. Don't let Bill Henley's crimes go unpunished, and don't let my silence protect him. I pray this letter is never needed, that my fears are unfounded and that I'm being paranoid. But if you're reading this, then I was right to be afraid. Find the truth. Make sure the children of Cedar Falls get the justice they deserve. Eleanor stared at the letter, her mind reeling. Everything they had believed about Sarah's disappearance was wrong. This wasn't the mysterious vanishing of a troubled teacher or the random crime of an opportunistic stranger. This was murder, committed to protect a criminal enterprise that had been stealing from the school for years. Bill Henley. The same man who had discovered Sarah's abandoned car, who had been part of the search effort, who had expressed such concern for her welfare. He had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, protected by the very community he had been robbing. Eleanor looked at the date on the letter again. May 15th, 2003, 5 months before Sarah disappeared. She had lived with this knowledge for months, wrestling with fear and uncertainty, trying to find the courage to expose the truth. The time capsule had been her insurance policy, her way of ensuring that the truth would eventually surface, even if she couldn't tell it herself. But why had it taken 4 years for the truth to emerge? Why had the chalkboard messages only begun appearing after Eleanor arrived at the school? Eleanor thought about the patterns she had documented, the increasing urgency of the messages. Perhaps Sarah's spirit, or whatever force had been guiding her, had been waiting for the right person to receive the communications. Someone who would be observant enough to notice the subtle signs, persistent enough to follow the clues, and brave enough to act on the truth. Eleanor gathered the contents of the time capsule, her hands steady now despite the magnitude of what she had discovered. She had to be careful, methodical. Bill Henley was still the school's custodian, still trusted by the community. He had successfully concealed his crime for 4 years, and he wouldn't hesitate to act if he realized the truth was about to emerge. But Eleanor also knew that she couldn't let Sarah's sacrifice be in vain. The teacher had given her life to protect the children and the school she loved. The least Eleanor could do was ensure that her courage wasn't wasted. As Eleanor walked back to her car, the time capsule secured in her bag, she felt a strange sensation. For the first time in months, the weight of the chalkboard messages seemed to lift from her shoulders. She understood now why they had appeared, why they had guided her to this moment. Sarah Mitchell had been trying to tell her story, and Eleanor had finally learned to listen. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the school early, as she had done so many times before, but this time she wasn't checking for messages on the chalkboard. This time, she was looking for the evidence Sarah had hidden, the proof that would finally bring justice to Cedar Falls. The chalkboard was clean when she entered room 12, its surface reflecting the morning light that streamed through the windows. But Eleanor knew that Sarah's messages were finished now. The truth had been revealed, and it was time for the living to act on behalf of the dead. Eleanor opened her notebook and began to write, documenting everything she had discovered. She would go to the police, she would share Sarah's letter, and she would make sure that Bill Henley faced justice for his crimes. But first, she had one more message to leave on the chalkboard, not from Sarah to her, but from her to Sarah. In her own neat handwriting, Eleanor wrote, "Message received. Truth will prevail. Rest in peace." Detective Robert Hayes had been with the Cedar Falls Police Department for 12 years, but he had never seen anything like the evidence Eleanor Vasquez presented to him on that July morning in 2007. The time capsule contents were spread across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for 4 years, waiting for someone to put them together. Sarah Mitchell's letter provided the motive and the suspect, but Detective Hayes knew that a 4-year-old accusation wouldn't be enough to secure a conviction. They needed current evidence, proof that Bill Henley's criminal operation had continued, physical evidence that could corroborate Sarah's claims. "Mrs. Vasquez," Detective Hayes said, studying the documents Eleanor had brought, "you understand that this is an extraordinary situation. We're essentially reopening a missing persons case based on messages you claim appeared on a chalkboard." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I understand how it sounds, Detective, but the evidence speaks for itself. Sarah Mitchell discovered a theft operation and was killed to keep her silent. Everything else is just details." Detective Hayes nodded slowly. Eleanor Vasquez was a credible witness, a respected educator with no history of mental illness or delusional behavior. More importantly, her story provided the missing piece that had always puzzled investigators. Why would Sarah Mitchell simply vanish without a trace? "We'll need to move carefully," Detective Hayes said. "If Henley realizes we're investigating him, he could destroy evidence or flee. We'll need to coordinate with the school district, conduct surveillance, and build a case methodically." The investigation began immediately. A team of officers conducted discreet surveillance of Bill Henley's movements, while forensic accountants examined the school's inventory records for the past 5 years. The basement storage room Sarah had mentioned was carefully searched, revealing irregularities in the way supplies were catalogued and stored. Meanwhile, Eleanor returned to her classroom, continuing her documentation of the evidence Sarah had hidden throughout the school. Following the clues in Sarah's letter, she discovered a manila envelope taped under a loose floorboard in the supply closet. Inside were photographs Sarah had taken of the theft operation, along with serial numbers and inventory lists that matched the missing supplies. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of Henley's operation. He had been systematically stealing from the school for years, using his position as custodian to access supplies after hours. The items were stored in the basement until they could be transported to buyers, probably other schools or businesses looking for discounted educational materials. But Sarah's letter had raised the stakes. Her discovery had threatened to expose not just theft, but a criminal enterprise that had been robbing the children of Cedar Falls for years. Henley had killed to protect his operation, and he had been living with that secret for 4 years. The breakthrough came when Detective Hayes obtained a warrant to search Henley's home. In the garage, they found boxes of school supplies that matched the inventory lists Sarah had compiled. More damning still, they discovered Sarah's missing purse, hidden in a toolbox along with her driver's license and credit cards. When confronted with the evidence, Bill Henley's carefully maintained facade crumbled. He had been living in fear for 4 years, waiting for someone to discover his secret. The stress had aged him, made him paranoid and jumpy. When Detective Hayes showed him Sarah's letter, Henley broke down completely. "I never meant for it to happen," he sobbed in the interrogation room. "She surprised me that night. I was loading the truck, and she appeared in the doorway. She had a camera, was taking pictures. I panicked." The full story emerged slowly, painfully. Sarah had confronted Henley about the theft operation, threatening to expose him unless he stopped immediately. But Henley had too much to lose. He had been using the money from the stolen supplies to support a gambling addiction that had consumed his savings. He couldn't stop, and he couldn't let Sarah destroy him. "I didn't plan to hurt her," Henley continued. "I just wanted to scare her, to make her understand that she needed to stay quiet. But she fought back. She was stronger than I expected. When she fell and hit her head on the concrete floor, I thought she was just unconscious." But Sarah Mitchell had died from her injuries, and Henley had faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could call for help, confess to the accident, and face the consequences of his theft operation. Or he could cover up what had happened, dispose of the evidence, and hope that no one would ever discover the truth. He chose to cover up the crime. Working through the night, Henley had wrapped Sarah's body and buried it in a remote section of the county landfill, a place where it would never be found. He had driven her car back to the school parking lot, staging the scene to make it appear as though she had simply vanished. The purse he kept as a trophy, unable to dispose of the final evidence of his crime. For 4 years, Henley had maintained his role as the grieving custodian, the man who had discovered Sarah's abandoned car, the helpful employee who assisted with the search efforts. He had attended the memorial services, had expressed concern for Sarah's family, had even helped comfort her students in the days after her disappearance. But the guilt had been eating away at him. Detective Hayes could see it in Henley's hollow eyes, in the way his hands shook as he signed his confession. The man had been living in a prison of his own making, haunted by the knowledge of what he had done. "The messages on the chalkboard," Detective Hayes asked Eleanor later. "Do you think they'll stop now?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. She had checked room 12 that morning, and the chalkboard was clean. Not just erased, but truly clean, as if it had been washed with a piece that hadn't existed for 4 years. "I think Sarah can rest now," Eleanor said simply. She got the justice she was looking for. The trial of Bill Henley became the biggest news story Cedar Falls had ever experienced. The small town struggled to understand how someone they had trusted for 15 years could have committed such a heinous crime. Parents questioned their own judgment, wondering what other dangers might be hiding in plain sight. But there was also a sense of closure, of justice finally served. Sarah Mitchell's family attended every day of the trial, finding some measure of peace in learning the truth about their daughter's fate. Her students, now in high school, gathered to remember the teacher who had died protecting the school she loved. The school district implemented new security measures and inventory controls, ensuring that such a crime could never happen again. A memorial garden was planted beside the oak tree where Sarah had buried the time capsule, a place where students could remember the teacher who had given her life for them. Eleanor Vasquez continued teaching in room 12, but the space felt different now. The oppressive weight of mystery had lifted, replaced by something warmer, a sense that Sarah's spirit was at peace. Helena never saw another message on the chalkboard, but she often felt Sarah's presence in the room, watching over the new generations of students who learned and grew within those walls. On the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, Eleanor would place fresh flowers by the chalkboard and tell her students about the teacher who had worked in this room before her. She spoke of Sarah's dedication, her love for her students, and her courage in the face of danger. "She wanted you to know," Eleanor would tell them, "that your education is precious, that knowledge is power, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it's difficult." The children would listen with wide eyes, understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves, a story that connected them to the past and to the teacher who had fought to protect their future. Bill Henley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days thinking about the night he chose greed over conscience, violence over honesty. The theft operation was dismantled, and the stolen supplies that could be recovered were returned to the schools that needed them. But perhaps the most important legacy of Sarah Mitchell's story was the lesson it taught the community of Cedar Falls. Sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us. Sometimes evil hides behind familiar faces and friendly smiles. And sometimes the truth takes years to surface, emerging only when the right person is brave enough to listen to voices that others can't hear. Eleanor Vasquez had become that person, the listener, the seeker, the one who refused to let Sarah's sacrifice be forgotten. She had learned that some messages transcend death, that love and justice can speak across the boundaries of time and space. In room 12, where Sarah Mitchell had once taught children about the power of stories and the importance of truth, her greatest lesson lived on. She had shown them that heroes aren't always the people who save the day dramatically. Sometimes they're the ones who plant seeds of truth in the darkness, trusting that someone someday will help those seeds grow into justice. The chalkboard stood silent now, its surface clean and ready for new lessons. But everyone who entered that room could feel the presence of the teacher who had died protecting it, whose final message had finally been heard. The truth always finds a way to speak, even when the voices of the living fall silent. And sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, we can hear the whispers of those who gave everything to ensure that justice would prevail. Sarah Mitchell's story became legend in Cedar Falls, not as a cautionary tale of mystery and fear, but as a testament to the power of courage, the importance of truth, and the enduring strength of a teacher's love for her students. In death, as in life, she had protected the children she served, ensuring that their education would continue in a place made safer by her sacrifice. The last entry in Eleanor's notebook simply read, "Message delivered, justice served, story complete." And in room 12, where chalk dust danced in the afternoon sunlight and children's laughter echoed off the walls, Sarah Mitchell's legacy lived on, not in mystery but in truth, not in fear, but in the enduring power of love to transcend even death itself.